He cleaned an abandoned attic. 14 days later, his lungs were filling with fluid. At first, the doctors thought it was pneumonia. Then they thought it was a severe case of influenza. Then they thought it might be a rare autoimmune disease attacking his lungs. They were wrong. By the time they discovered what was actually happening, William Smith was already drowning. Not in a river, not in an ocean. Inside his own chest. 21 days after climbing into that attic, he was dead. The thing that killed him was smaller than a grain of dust. It had been hiding in the darkness above his ceiling for years. Waiting. When paramedics wheeled Williams through the emergency room doors, his oxygen level had fallen into the danger zone. His skin had turned pale gray. Every breath sounded wet. Every breath sounded like work. The emergency physician ordered a chest X-ray, then a CT scan, then an ICU bed. The images looked impossible. Both lungs were turning white. Fluid was flooding the tiny air sacs responsible for moving oxygen into his blood. His body was suffocating despite the fact that his airway was completely open. And here is the part that terrified the doctors. Williams was only 38 years old. He didn't smoke. He didn't have asthma. He didn't have heart failure. He didn't have any of the conditions that should have caused lungs to fail this quickly. Something had triggered a catastrophic reaction inside his body. Something that had started weeks earlier. Somewhere else. The answer was not in the hospital. It was not in his blood work. It was not in his medical history. The answer was sitting inside an abandoned attic filled with dust, rodent nests, and years of forgotten debris. A place Williams entered for only a few hours. A place he walked out of feeling completely fine. A place he never thought about again until it killed him.
This is Hidden Pathogens.
Williams Smith had wanted an old house for as long as he could remember. Not a new one. Not one of the identical developments where every driveway looked the same and every lawn followed the same blueprint. He wanted history. The house he found sat at the end of a quiet road outside Flagstaff, Arizona, built in 1952, 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, a wraparound porch, and a price that seemed almost too good to be true. There was a reason for that. The property had been vacant for nearly 7 years. The previous owner had died. The house passed through relatives. The relatives argued over what to do with it. Meanwhile, nobody maintained it. Nobody cleaned it. Nobody lived there. By the time Williams bought it, nature had started moving in. The realtor mentioned some rodent activity. Nothing unusual. A few droppings in the garage. Some evidence of nesting in the attic. The sort of thing buyers hear all the time. Williams wasn't worried. He grew up in rural Arizona. Mice were just part of life. His wife, Sarah, felt differently. The first weekend after moving in, she climbed halfway up the attic ladder and immediately came back down. You should see this. Williams climbed up after her. The beam from his flashlight swept across decades of dust, cardboard boxes, old insulation, broken furniture. Then he saw them. Mouse droppings, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered across the attic floor, packed into corners, collected beneath insulation, some fresh, some so old they had turned gray. There were nests too, large ones, built from shredded paper, insulation, and cloth. Signs that rodents had been living up there for years. Sarah wrinkled her nose. That doesn't look safe, Williams laughed. They're mouse droppings. Exactly, they're old. You don't know that. Williams waved his flashlight toward the mess. It'll take me a couple hours. I'll clean it out next weekend. Sarah looked around one last time. At least wear a mask. Of course. But like a lot of promises people make about safety, that promise only sounded important before the work started. Remember that, because later, when doctors were trying to figure out why Williams's lungs were failing, they would discover that almost everything came down to a decision that lasted less than 10 seconds, whether or not to wear a mask. At the time, it didn't seem important. 3 weeks later, it would become the most important decision of his life. The following Saturday was unusually warm, the kind of dry Arizona heat that turns attics into ovens. By 10 in the morning, Williams was carrying garbage bags, a broom, and a shop vacuum toward the attic ladder. Sarah noticed something immediately. Where's your mask? Williams looked up, still holding the ladder, still smiling. I'll be fine. You said you were going to wear one. It's just dust. She started to say something else, then stopped. After all, how dangerous could an attic really be? Williams climbed into the opening and disappeared into the darkness. For the next 3 hours, he worked alone. At first, the job seemed simple. Move boxes, bag trash, clear pathways. Then he started disturbing the nests. Every sweep of the broom launched dust into the air, clouds of it. Fine grey particles hanging in the sunlight, pouring through gaps in the roof. The attic became hazy, almost foggy. Williams coughed, then kept working. He swept piles of droppings into heaps, dragged old insulation across the floor, pulled apart abandoned nests. Every movement stirred up more debris, more dust, more particles floating through the air. At one point, he opened a cardboard box that had become home to generations of rodents. The bottom collapsed. The contents exploded across the floor. Droppings, nesting material, dried urine, dust. Williams stepped backward into the cloud. He covered his mouth for a second, then laughed to himself. The attic smelled terrible, but the job was almost finished. By early afternoon, he climbed back down the ladder covered in sweat and insulation fibers. Sarah looked up from the kitchen. You look awful. I feel awful. You should have worn the mask. Williams grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator. Told you, just dust. Neither of them realized what had happened during those 3 hours. Neither of them knew that invisible particles had been filling the air around. Neither of them knew he had inhaled them thousands of times, deep into his lungs, past the body's normal defenses, into places where oxygen enters the bloodstream. The cleanup was over. The attic was cleaner than it had been in years. The dust settled. Life moved on. Williams grilled burgers that evening, watched a baseball game, went to bed. The next morning, he woke up feeling completely normal, and that was the most dangerous part. Because while Williams was congratulating himself on finishing the job, something had already entered his body. Something he couldn't see, couldn't feel, and couldn't stop. The countdown had already begun. Here is what happened inside Williams's body while he was cleaning the attic. The droppings scattered across the floor did not look dangerous. Most were no larger than grains of rice. Some had been sitting there for years. Others were much newer. What Williams could not see was what surrounded them: urine, saliva, microscopic particles left behind by rodents that had spent years living above his ceiling. Somewhere among those rodents was one carrying Hantavirus. The animal never looked sick. It never coughed, never staggered, never showed any obvious signs of disease. Rodents infected with Hantavirus often appear perfectly healthy. But every time they urinate, every time they leave droppings behind, they shed viral particles into their environment. For years, those particles remained trapped inside the attic, waiting. Then Williams arrived with a broom. Every sweep launched tiny particles into the air. Every nest he disturbed released more. Every pile of droppings he moved created another invisible cloud. The particles became airborne, small enough to float, small enough to remain suspended in the dust, small enough to travel deep into the lungs of anyone breathing nearby. Williams inhaled thousands of them. He never noticed. The human body filters out many dangers before they can reach the lungs. Dust gets trapped in the nose. Mucus catches larger particles. Tiny hairs sweep debris away. But virus particles are different. Many are small enough to slip past those defenses. Deep into the lungs. Deep into the microscopic air sacs where oxygen enters the bloodstream. The infection began there. Not with pain, not with coughing, not with fever. The virus entered cells lining the blood vessels inside Williams's lungs. It began replicating, quietly, silently, cell by cell. The immune system noticed almost nothing. There was no alarm, no warning sign, no sensation telling Williams something was wrong. He climbed down from the attic, feeling exhausted from work. But the real damage had already started, and it was spreading. Because unlike a cut or a burn, this injury would remain invisible for days. The virus was inside him now, and it had all the time it needed. For the next 7 days, Williams felt completely normal. He went to work Monday morning, answered emails, attended meetings, complained about traffic. Nothing unusual. If someone had told him a potentially fatal infection was spreading through his lungs, he would have laughed, because there was no evidence of it. No cough, no fever, no shortness of breath. Nothing. Life continued exactly as it always had. On Wednesday evening, he helped his daughter with her math homework. On Thursday, he grilled chicken in the backyard. Friday night was movie night. The same routine they had followed for years. Sarah occasionally mentioned the attic, mostly as a joke. "You still alive after all that dust?" Williams laughed. "Barely." The attic cleanup was already becoming one of those household stories which families tell each other. The unpleasant chore nobody wanted to do. The dirty job that was finally finished. By the weekend, Williams had nearly forgotten about it entirely. He mowed the lawn, watched football, went grocery shopping, planned a camping trip for later that month. Nothing about his behavior suggested a medical emergency was approaching. And that is one of the most frightening things about virus. The delay. People expect dangerous illnesses to strike immediately. They expect consequences to follow actions. Eat spoiled food, get sick, touch a hot stove, get burned. But virus doesn't work that way. You inhale it, you go to work, you watch television, you kiss your spouse, you tuck your children into bed, and all the while the virus continues multiplying. Hidden, patient, unnoticed. William's family believed the danger was behind them. After all, it had already been a week. If something serious was going to happen, surely it would have happened by now. It hadn't, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it would arrive fast. 8 days after cleaning the attic, Williams woke up feeling cold. Not slightly cold, shivering cold. The kind that makes you pull blankets tighter around yourself. The kind that makes your teeth chatter. Sarah touched his forehead. "You're burning up!" Williams sat upright. His head hurt, his muscles hurt, even his joints hurt. The fever came out of nowhere. By lunchtime, it was over 102 degrees. Then came the chills, then the exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that makes getting out of a chair feel like work. He called in sick. Spent most of the day on the couch, drinking water, sleeping, watching television without really paying attention. The next morning was worse. His legs felt heavy, his back ached. His shoulders felt like he had spent the weekend lifting weights. Every muscle in his body hurt. Sarah suggested urgent care. Williams shook his head. "It's probably the flu." Honestly, it seemed like a reasonable explanation. Flu season was approaching. Several co-workers had recently been sick. The symptoms matched: fever, chills, body aches, fatigue. Nothing about it screamed rare viral infection. Nothing about it pointed toward an attic. Nothing about it suggested that his lungs would soon begin to fail. For 3 days, Williams stayed home, sleeping, sweating, waiting to feel better. Instead, he felt worse. The fever kept returning. The aches intensified. Even walking across the room left him tired. Still, neither Williams nor Sarah felt truly alarmed. People get the flu all the time. Most recover. The human brain is wired to choose ordinary explanations first. And ordinary explanations were exactly what made virus so dangerous. Because while Williams thought he was fighting a bad case of the flu, the virus was preparing for its most devastating phase. The phase that kills. The phase where the lungs begin to fill with fluid. The phase that turns a healthy 38-year-old man into an ICU patient almost overnight. By day 11, Sarah stopped asking Williams if he was feeling better. Instead, she started asking why he wasn't. The fever was still there. The body aches were still there. The exhaustion was getting worse. Most flu cases begin improving after a few days. Williams wasn't improving. If anything, he seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. That morning, Sarah found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. "You need to see someone." Williams rubbed his eyes. "It's just taking longer than normal. You've been saying that for 3 days." He didn't argue, mostly because he no longer had the energy. A few hours later, they arrived at an urgent care clinic 15 minutes from their house. The waiting room was crowded. Parents holding sick children. College students coughing into tissues. A television mounted in the corner playing daytime news. Nothing about the scene suggested anyone was dealing with a rare and potentially fatal infection, including Williams. When the nurse called his name, his temperature was still elevated. His heart rate was slightly fast, but everything else appeared reassuring. His oxygen level looked normal. His blood pressure was normal. His lungs sounded clear through a stethoscope. No wheezing, no crackles, no obvious signs of respiratory distress. The physician entered a few minutes later. She reviewed the symptoms: fever, chills, muscle aches, fatigue, headache, no recent surgeries, no major medical conditions, no smoking history, no significant medications. The presentation looked familiar, very familiar, because hundreds of patients walk into urgent care clinics every week with exactly those symptoms. Most of them have a viral illness. Most recover on their own. The physician ordered a rapid influenza test. Negative. She ordered a COVID test. Negative. Williams expected that to concern her. It didn't. There are dozens of viruses capable of producing flu-like symptoms. Most are never identified, and most don't need to be. The body clears them without treatment. The doctor finished typing her notes. Then she delivered the diagnosis. Looks like a viral illness. Williams nodded. Exactly what he expected to hear. The physician recommended rest, hydration, over-the-counter fever medication, return if symptoms worsened, otherwise give it time. The entire visit lasted less than 30 minutes. No blood work, no imaging, no hospitalization. And honestly, that made sense. At this stage, there was almost nothing pointing toward the virus. The disease was still wearing the disguise of a common viral infection. The dangerous phase had not started yet. The doctor couldn't diagnose what she couldn't see, and Williams couldn't describe symptoms he hadn't developed. Neither one realized that the virus was already moving into its next stage, the stage doctors fear. The stage where patients stop feeling like they have the flu and start feeling like they can't breathe. Williams left urgent care relieved. Sarah felt relieved too. A viral illness. Nothing serious. A few more days of rest. Some fluids, maybe some soup, maybe a little more sleep. Then life would return to normal. Or at least that's what they thought. That night, Williams drank water, took fever medication, and went to bed early. The urgent care paperwork sat folded on the kitchen counter. The diagnosis printed clearly across the top. Viral syndrome. 3 words. 3 completely reasonable words, and 3 words that could not have been more wrong. While Williams was sitting in urgent care being told to rest and drink fluids, a battle was unfolding inside his lungs. And for the first time, his immune system realized it had an enemy. For days, Hantavirus had been quietly multiplying inside cells lining the tiny blood vessels of his lungs. Those vessels are called capillaries. They are some of the thinnest structures in the human body. So thin that oxygen can pass through them. So thin that life depends on them staying intact. Normally, the walls of those capillaries function like a carefully controlled barrier. Oxygen passes through, blood stays where it belongs, fluid stays where it belongs, everything remains balanced. Hantavirus changes that balance. The virus itself is dangerous. But what makes the disease deadly is what happens next. The immune system finally notices the infection, and it responds with overwhelming force. White blood cells flood the lungs. Inflammatory chemicals pour into the bloodstream. The body's alarm system shifts into maximum alert. The goal is to destroy the infection. Instead, the response begins damaging the lungs themselves. The walls of the capillaries become leaky. Tiny gaps appear between cells. Fluid begins escaping from the bloodstream. At first, the amount is microscopic. A few drops, then a little more, then more. The lungs are designed to exchange air, not store liquid. Every drop of fluid makes that process harder. And the worst part? Williams couldn't feel any of it happening. Not yet. He was still thinking about fevers, still thinking about body aches, still thinking about the diagnosis from urgent care. But inside his chest, the stage was already being set for catastrophe. The flood had begun. He just hadn't noticed the water rising. The first sign appeared on the morning of day 12. Williams woke up and walked toward the kitchen. Halfway there, he stopped. Not because of pain, because he felt winded. The sensation lasted only a few seconds, then it disappeared. He blamed weakness from being sick. That explanation seemed reasonable. After all, he had barely eaten in days. Sarah noticed him leaning against the counter. "You okay?" "Just tired." He wasn't, at least not entirely. By that afternoon, he developed a cough. It wasn't dramatic, no blood, no violent coughing fits. Just a persistent irritation, a cough that seemed to come from deep inside his chest. The next morning, things became harder to ignore. Their bedroom was upstairs. Williams climbed the staircase every day without thinking about it. This time he reached the top and had to stop. His breathing felt strange. Not painful, just difficult. As if the effort required more work than it should. He stood in the hallway, taking slow breaths, waiting for the sensation to pass. It did. But not completely. The cough continued. The fatigue worsened. The shortness of breath became more noticeable. By evening, Sarah was watching him carefully. The fever was still there. The cough was getting worse. And now he seemed unable to walk across the house without becoming exhausted. Maybe we should go back. Williams shook his head. The doctor already said it was viral. The statement sounded reassuring, but it contained a dangerous assumption that the diagnosis was complete, that nothing new was developing. That's because a doctor had evaluated him yesterday. Today's symptoms must fit the same explanation. Unfortunately, diseases don't care about diagnoses. They continue progressing whether doctors recognize them or not. And Hantavirus was progressing fast. The fluid leaking from Williams's capillaries was beginning to accumulate inside his lungs. Less oxygen was reaching his bloodstream. His body was compensating. His heart was beating faster. His breathing was becoming deeper, working harder, trying desperately to keep up. For now, it was enough. By tomorrow, it wouldn't be. Day 13. Shortly after sunrise, Williams woke up gasping. For a moment, he thought he was having a nightmare. Then he realized he couldn't catch his breath. He sat upright. His chest felt tight. Every inhale seemed incomplete. Every exhale felt unsatisfying, as if no matter how much air entered his lungs, it wasn't enough. Sarah immediately knew something was wrong. His breathing was fast, too fast. His face looked pale. His voice sounded strained. "I'm taking you to the hospital." This time Williams didn't argue. The drive took 18 minutes. By the time they arrived, speaking full sentences had become difficult. The triage nurse clipped a pulse oximeter onto his finger. The number appeared on the screen, 89%. Normal oxygen saturation is generally above 95. Williams's was falling. The nurse immediately moved him ahead of several waiting patients. Supplemental oxygen was started. Blood was drawn. Monitors were attached. A physician listened to his lungs. This time things sounded different. Crackles, wet sounds, evidence that fluid was accumulating where air should be. A chest X-ray was ordered immediately. The image appeared on the screen minutes later. The emergency physician stared at it, then called for a radiologist. Both lungs showed abnormal white patches. Large areas that should have appeared dark with air were becoming opaque. Something was filling the lungs. Fluid, inflammation, infection. The most likely explanation seemed obvious. Severe pneumonia. The diagnosis fit. Recent viral symptoms: fever, cough, shortness of breath. Abnormal chest imaging. The doctors began treating him accordingly. Antibiotics were ordered. Additional oxygen was provided. More tests followed. For a brief moment, everyone believed they understood what was happening. But there was a problem. Williams's lungs were deteriorating too quickly, far too quickly. Hour by hour, his oxygen requirements increased. Hour by hour, his breathing became more labored. And despite everything the medical team was doing, he continued getting worse. Somewhere in the emergency department, a physician looked at the chart and felt a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't fitting. This looked like pneumonia, but it wasn't behaving like pneumonia. And until someone figured out why, William Smith was running out of time. If you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. And wait till this might be even more dangerous. The first 12 hours in the hospital destroyed any remaining hope that this was an ordinary pneumonia. When Williams arrived, he needed a small amount of supplemental oxygen. By afternoon, that wasn't enough. The flow rate was increased, then increased again, then increased again. Each adjustment helped for a little while. Then his oxygen levels started falling once more. The nurses noticed the pattern before anyone said it out loud. Williams was losing ground, fast. By evening, a respiratory therapist wheeled a larger machine into his room. High-flow oxygen, warm, humidified. delivered under pressure. The device blasted oxygen through tubes beneath his nose. The flow was so powerful it sounded like a constant wind. For many patients, high-flow oxygen prevents the need for a ventilator. For Williams, it became a temporary delay, not a solution. His breathing rate climbed past 30 breaths per minute, then 35. Every breath like work. The muscles in his neck tightened. His chest rose and fell rapidly. The simple act of speaking became exhausting. Sarah sat beside the bed watching numbers on the monitor. Oxygen saturation, heart rate, blood pressure. Numbers she had never paid attention to before. Now they felt like a countdown. Every time the oxygen level dipped, her stomach dropped. Every time an alarm sounded, she looked toward the doorway, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. Nobody could. Not yet. Williams's parents arrived shortly after midnight. His brother drove 6 hours to reach the hospital. By morning, the waiting room was full. Family members whispering, drinking bad coffee, staring at their phones without reading them. Everyone asking the same question. How does a healthy 38-year-old deteriorate this quickly? The ICU team had the same question. Because Williams wasn't supposed to be here. He had no major medical problems, no chronic lung disease, no heart disease, no history suggesting this kind of collapse. Yet his lungs were failing in real time. Shortly after sunrise, the decision was made. Williams was being transferred to intensive care. The disease was winning, and nobody knew why. The ICU physician reviewing Williams's chart noticed something strange. Not a lab result, not an imaging finding, a missing piece of information. The diagnosis of severe pneumonia made sense, but something felt incomplete. The progression was too aggressive. The patient's age didn't fit. The timeline didn't fit. And most importantly, none of the tests were identifying a cause. Blood cultures were negative. Viral panels were negative. The usual suspects weren't appearing, so she started over, not with tests, with questions. She sat beside Williams's bed while he struggled through short answers between breaths. Recent travel? No. New medications? No. Sick contacts? No. Camping? Hiking? Animal exposure? Nothing significant. Then she asked a question nobody else had asked. Have you been around rodents recently? Williams frowned. At first the question seemed random. Then Sarah spoke up. The attic! The physician looked up. What attic? Sarah explained. The old house, the years of rodent activity, the droppings, the nests, the dust, the cleanup, the missing mask. The physician's expression changed immediately. Not panic, recognition. The kind doctors develop after years of seeing patterns others miss. When was this? About 2 weeks ago. The room became very quiet, because suddenly the timeline fit, the exposure fit, the symptoms fit, the lung failure fit. For the first time since Williams entered the hospital, the doctors had a theory that explained everything. The physician ordered additional testing, but she already suspected the answer. A rare virus carried by rodents. A disease most doctors never encounter. A disease capable of turning healthy lungs into fluid-filled organs within days. Hantavirus. And if she was right, Williams was in far more danger than anyone had realized. Here is why that question mattered. And here is why doctors fear this disease. Hantavirus is not common. In fact, most physicians will never personally treat a case. Millions of people encounter mice every year. Most never become infected. Even among rodent exposures, transmission is relatively rare. That rarity creates a problem. Doctors naturally think of common diseases first. Influenza, COVID, pneumonia, asthma, those explanations are usually correct. Hantavirus hides behind them. The virus is carried primarily by certain wild rodents. In North America, deer mice are among the most important carriers. The animals themselves often appear healthy, but they shed the virus through urine, droppings, and saliva. When those materials dry out, they can become part of household dust, sweep the floor, disturb a nest, open an abandoned shed, clean an attic, and the virus can become airborne. You don't need to touch a mouse. You don't need to be bitten. You only need to breathe. Once inside the body, the virus targets blood vessels, particularly those inside the lungs. For several days, symptoms resemble a common viral illness. Fever, headache, muscle pain, fatigue, nothing unusual. Then comes the cardiopulmonary phase, the phase doctors fear, the phase that kills. Patients suddenly become short of breath. Oxygen levels collapse, fluid floods the lungs. Many require intensive care, many require mechanical ventilation. And despite modern medicine, some never leave the hospital. The disease is rare, but when it appears, it can be devastatingly aggressive. Which raises an obvious question. If the virus infects blood vessels, if the virus enters through the lungs, why do patients feel like they're drowning? The answer is even more frightening than most people realize. Most people imagine pneumonia when they hear the words fluid in the lungs. They picture an infection spreading through lung tissue, pus, mucus, inflammation, something clogging the airways. That wasn't what was happening to Williams. What was happening was worse, because the virus wasn't filling his lungs with fluid. His own bloodstream was. To understand why, you need to understand how breathing actually works. Inside the lungs are hundreds of millions of microscopic air sacs called alveoli. Think of them as tiny balloons. Every breath fills them with oxygen. Wrapped around each alveolus is a network of capillaries carrying blood. The walls separating air from blood are incredibly thin. Thin enough that oxygen can pass through. Thin enough that carbon dioxide can leave. Every second of every day, your survival depends on that barrier remaining intact. For most people it does. For Williams, it didn't. The Hantavirus infection had triggered a massive immune response. White blood cells flooded his lungs. Inflammatory chemicals surged through his bloodstream. The capillaries became increasingly damaged, increasingly permeable, increasingly leaky. Imagine punching thousands of microscopic holes into a garden hose. Water starts escaping. At first, only a little, then more, then enough that the hose can no longer do its job. That was happening throughout Williams's lungs. Fluid began leaking from the bloodstream into the tissue surrounding the alveoli, then into the alveoli themselves. The air sacs designed to hold oxygen were slowly filling with liquid one by one, thousands at a time, millions at a time. Every drop made breathing harder. Not because air couldn't enter his lungs. It could. The problem was what happened after. Oxygen was reaching the alveoli. But oxygen cannot easily move through fluid. The greater the flood became, the greater the distance oxygen had to travel. And eventually that distance became impossible. Williams could breathe, but his body could not use what he was breathing. Imagine trying to breathe through a sponge soaked with water. Air still exists. The lungs still move, but oxygen struggles to reach the bloodstream. The sensation is terrifying. Patients describe it as starvation, not for food, for air. No matter how deeply they inhale, they never feel satisfied. No matter how many breaths they take, they never feel caught up. That was what Williams was experiencing. His lungs were becoming reservoirs of fluid. His oxygen levels continued falling. The monitors showed it. The nurses saw it. The doctors saw it. And despite every intervention, the trend continued. 92%, 89, 86, 84. The numbers moved in only one direction. Down. The high-flow oxygen machine worked harder. Williams worked harder. His chest rose and fell relentlessly. His heart raced. His body was attempting to compensate, trying desperately to deliver oxygen to organs that were beginning to starve. But compensation has limits. Eventually, the body runs out of options. And when that happens, doctors begin discussing measures nobody wants to hear. Ventilators, life support, the possibility that the patient may not survive. That conversation began late that night. Sarah was sitting beside the bed when an ICU physician entered the room. She knew immediately this wasn't a routine update. Doctors don't sit down unless the news is serious. The physician pulled up a chair, then explained what the family had already begun to suspect. Williams's lungs were failing. The oxygen wasn't enough. The disease was progressing faster than they could stop it. And unless something changed soon, they would have to place him on a ventilator. And for a moment, nobody spoke. The machines filled the silence. The hiss of oxygen, the beeping of monitors, the rhythmic sounds of an ICU fighting against time. Then Sarah asked the question every family asks. The question nobody wants to ask. Is he going to die? The physician paused, and for the first time since Williams arrived at the hospital, nobody had a reassuring answer. By the following morning, Williams was losing the fight. The high-flow oxygen machine was running near its limits. Yet his oxygen levels continued drifting downward. The ICU team watched the monitors carefully. So did Williams, and that was part of the problem. Every breath had become a conscious effort. Every inhale felt incomplete. Every exhale brought no relief. Patients can only sustain that level of work for so long. Eventually, the muscles responsible for breathing begin to fail. The body becomes exhausted. The lungs become exhausted, and then everything gets worse. The ICU physician explained the situation to Williams and Sarah. The ventilator was no longer a possibility. It was a necessity. A breathing machine would take over the work his lungs could no longer perform. The procedure itself sounded simple. The reality was terrifying. A tube would be inserted through his mouth and into his airway. The machine would breathe for him. He would need medications to keep him unconscious. Once the tube went in, he would not be able to talk. Not to Sarah, not to his parents, not to anyone. Williams understood exactly what that meant. Many patients never wake up after intubation, not because of the ventilator, because of the disease that made the ventilator necessary. The room grew quiet. Sarah squeezed his hand. His mother stood near the doorway, crying silently. The physician asked if there were any questions. Nobody had one, because everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't the next step toward recovery. This was the next step toward survival. A nurse began preparing medications. Another gathered equipment. A respiratory therapist adjusted monitors. The room suddenly became busy, purposeful, efficient, practiced. The sort of coordinated movement that only happens when a patient's condition is becoming critical. Minutes later, sedatives entered Williams's IV. His eyelids grew heavy. The room became blurry. The last thing he saw was Sarah. The last thing he felt was her hand. Then the medications took over. The breathing tube was inserted. The ventilator began its steady rhythm. Williams never spoke another word. Outside the ICU, his family sat in the waiting room. The television played quietly. Nobody watched it. Coffee grew cold in paper cups. Phones remained untouched. Every few minutes someone glanced toward the ICU doors, waiting, hoping, trying to interpret every nurse who walked through. Hours passed, then more hours. The ventilator kept Williams alive, but it wasn't curing the disease, and the doctors knew they were running out of time. By that evening, the ICU team had exhausted most conventional options. The ventilator was delivering high concentrations of oxygen. The settings continued increasing, yet Williams's blood oxygen levels remained dangerously low. The problem wasn't getting air into his lungs anymore. The problem was what happened after. The fluid-filled alveoli could no longer transfer enough oxygen into his bloodstream. The ventilator could push air in, but it couldn't repair the damage. One of the critical care physicians raised a possibility. ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. In simple terms, a machine that temporarily takes over the job of the lungs. Blood leaves the body. The machine adds oxygen, removes carbon dioxide, then returns the blood to the patient. It is one of the most aggressive forms of life support available. For some patients with severe hantavirus infection, ECMO becomes the difference between life and death. But there was a problem. Not every hospital has ECMO. This one didn't. The team immediately began contacting larger medical centers. Phone calls, consultations, transfer requests. The search stretched across multiple states. Every minute mattered. The disease wasn't waiting. Unfortunately, neither were the realities of modern medicine. Some centers had no available beds. Others already had ECMO patients occupying every machine. A few were simply too far away. Williams's condition was deteriorating faster than transfer arrangements could be completed. The physicians continued making calls anyway, because there was nothing else left to do. Late that night, one intensivist walked into the family waiting room. Everyone stood up immediately. His expression told them everything before he spoke. The transfer was proving difficult. Resources were limited. Hospitals were full. The team was still trying, but they could not make promises. Sarah felt the floor disappear beneath her. Until that moment, she had assumed there would always be another option. Another treatment, another machine, another specialist. Now she was learning something medicine teaches families every day. Eventually, options ran out. The doctors returned to the ICU. The family returned to their chairs. And somewhere behind the closed doors, Williams's body continued losing a battle it could no longer win. The first organ to begin failing wasn't the lungs, it was the circulatory system. Shortly after midnight, Williams's blood pressure started falling, at first only slightly, then more, then rapidly. Nurses increased medications designed to support circulation. For a while they worked, then they stopped working. The inflammatory response that had damaged his lungs was now affecting the rest of his body. Blood vessels throughout his system became unstable. Fluid leaked into surrounding tissues. Circulating blood volume decreased. The heart struggled to compensate. The monitors reflected the change immediately. Numbers that should have remained steady began moving in the wrong direction. Alarm after alarm sounded throughout the night. Doctors adjusted medications, added new medications, ordered additional labs. The results came back worse each time. Then the kidneys began showing signs of injury. Healthy kidneys continuously filter waste from the bloodstream. Williams's were slowing down. Blood tests revealed rising levels of waste products. Urine output dropped, then dropped again. The organs were no longer receiving enough oxygen. No organ functions well without oxygen. Not the kidneys, not the liver, not the brain, not the heart. The crisis was spreading. One failing system placing stress on another. A chain reaction moving through the body. By sunrise, Williams required multiple medications just to maintain blood pressure. The ventilator settings had climbed even higher. His oxygen levels remained unstable. His kidneys were deteriorating. His circulation was deteriorating. His lungs were failing, and the disease continued advancing. The ICU team had reached the stage every physician dreads. The stage where treatments become less about reversing the illness and more about preventing immediate collapse. The stage where survival becomes increasingly unlikely. Outside the ICU, the family sensed it. Updates grew shorter. The doctors became more cautious with their words. Nobody was discussing discharge anymore. Nobody was discussing recovery timelines. The conversation had changed. Now the question was no longer how long Williams would stay in the hospital. The question was whether he would ever leave it. And for the first time since he cleaned the attic, the answer was beginning to look frighteningly clear. The final night began quietly. No dramatic alarms. No sudden emergency. No single moment where everyone realized it was over. Instead, there was a growing understanding among the medical team that Williams's body was reaching its limit. The ventilator continued its steady rhythm, pushing air in, pulling air out, performing a task his lungs could no longer do themselves. But each new blood gas result looked worse than the last. Each new lab report revealed another problem. The doctors adjusted medications, changed ventilator settings, repeated imaging, ordered additional tests. None of it changed the direction of the disease. By evening, the ICU physician requested a family meeting. Sarah already knew why. Families always know. Even before the words are spoken, Williams's parents sat beside her. His brother stood near the wall. The physician explained the situation carefully. The lungs were failing. The kidneys were failing. His blood pressure required increasing amounts of medication support. The team was continuing treatment, but recovery was becoming increasingly unlikely. The room fell silent. Nobody argued. Nobody demanded another treatment, because everyone could see what the doctors saw. The evidence was everywhere, in the monitors, in the machines, in the growing number of medications keeping his body functioning. The family was allowed extended bedside access that night. One by one, they entered the room. Williams's mother held his hand. His father spoke quietly about childhood memories, stories from baseball games, camping trips, the first bicycle, the first car. Stories Williams couldn't hear, or perhaps could. No one truly knows. Sarah sat beside him longest. She talked about ordinary things, the backyard, their daughter, the unfinished camping trip, the groceries still sitting at home, the attic. Eventually, she stopped talking and simply held his hand because there was nothing left to say. Shortly after midnight, several nurses entered the room. More blood pressure medication, more adjustments, more attempts to stabilize a body that no longer wanted to cooperate. The ICU team continued fighting, because that's what they do. Even when the odds are disappearing, even when everyone understands what is coming, nobody quits. Not the doctors, not the nurses, not the family, not until the very end. The call came shortly before dawn. The night nurse noticed the blood pressure falling again, this time faster than before. Additional medication was started, then increased again. Nothing changed. Williams's circulation was collapsing. The heart was still beating, but it was losing the ability to sustain the rest of the body. The physician arrived within minutes. The ICU became busy once more, nurses moving quickly, monitors sounding alarms, orders being given, new medications hanging from IV poles. For a brief moment, it looked as though the numbers might stabilize. Then they dropped again. The oxygen level fell, the blood pressure fell, the heart rate became erratic. One system after another began shutting down. The family was called to the bedside. They arrived just before sunrise. The sky outside was beginning to brighten. Inside the ICU, the machines continued their mechanical chorus. The physician explained what was happening. The body was failing, despite every intervention, despite every medication, despite every effort. There was nothing left to reverse the disease. A few minutes later, Williams's heart rhythm changed. The monitor displayed a pattern every ICU physician recognizes instantly. The final collapse. The room became very quiet. Even the alarms seemed distant. The physician checked for a pulse, then checked again. The nurses stopped moving. Everyone already knew. Stillness settled over the room. The physician looked toward the family, then spoke the words every family fears. Time of death, 6:17 a.m. For a moment nobody reacted. The words felt unreal, as though they belonged to another family, another room, another story. Then Sarah began to cry. Williams's mother buried her face in her husband's shoulder. His brother stared at the floor. The ventilator was disconnected. The monitors were silenced. The machines that had spent days fighting to keep Williams alive gradually disappeared from the room, and for the first time in weeks, everything was quiet. 14 days after cleaning an attic, 10 days after his first symptoms, less than a week after arriving at the hospital, William Smith was gone. He was 38 years old. Most deaths end with a death certificate. This one's triggered an investigation, because Hantavirus is not a common disease. When a case is confirmed, public health officials want to know why and where. Several days after Williams's death, investigators visited the house. The goal wasn't to assign blame. The goal was to identify the source. The answers didn't take long to find. The attic still contained evidence everywhere. Droppings remained beneath insulation, inside wall spaces, behind stored furniture. Rodent pathways crossed the floor. Nests were packed into corners, some abandoned, others surprisingly recent. Investigators documented everything. Photographs, samples, measurements. The attic that had seemed merely dirty now looked very different. It looked dangerous. As the inspection expanded, additional signs of infestation appeared throughout the property. The detached garage, storage sheds, spaces beneath the house. Years of vacancy had allowed rodents to establish themselves almost everywhere. The house had become an ideal habitat. One investigator later described it as exactly the kind of environment associated with hantavirus exposure. The pattern fit perfectly. The timeline fit perfectly. The disease fit perfectly. Somewhere among those rodents had been the carrier. Not a monster, not an exotic animal, not something unusual. Just a mouse, one infected mouse among many. That was all it took. Years of contamination, 3 hours of cleaning, thousands of airborne particles, one exposure, one infection, one death. The attic was eventually professionally remediated. Protective equipment, specialized cleaning procedures, disinfection, ventilation, the exact precautions Williams had never used. By then, it no longer mattered. The danger was gone, the virus was gone, the nests were gone, the droppings were gone, but the consequences remained. Because the thing that killed Williams wasn't hidden in some distant jungle. It wasn't lurking in a foreign country. It wasn't waiting inside a laboratory. It was sitting above his ceiling the entire time, and he never knew it was there. At this point, you might be wondering how often this actually happens. The answer is complicated, because hantavirus is both rare and deadly, and those two facts together create a dangerous illusion. Most people have never heard of it. Most people will never know someone who has had it. Most people will go their entire lives without encountering a single confirmed case. That rarity is exactly why it gets missed. When doctors hear hoofbeats, they think horses, not zebras. When homeowners see mouse droppings, they think nuisance, not life-threatening infection. When someone develops fever, chills, and body aches, they think not hantavirus, and most of the time they're right. But not always. Public health have documented cases across North America for decades. The stories often sound different at first. A farmer cleaning a barn, a homeowner opening a long-abandoned cabin, a worker clearing out a storage building, a hunter staying in a rodent-infested shelter. Different people, different locations, different circumstances, yet the same pattern appears again and again. Rodent exposure, a delay of days or weeks, flu-like symptoms, then sudden respiratory collapse. The disease remains uncommon, but uncommon does not mean impossible. Lightning strikes are uncommon. People still get struck. Airplane crashes are uncommon. People still prepare for them. The danger with hantavirus is that most people don't prepare at all, because they don't know it exists. And if they do know it exists, they often underestimate it. After all, how dangerous can a mouse be? The answer is sitting in this story. A healthy 38-year-old man. No major medical problems, no smoking history, no chronic illness. Dead less than a month after cleaning an attic. Not because he touched a wild animal. Not because he traveled to some remote location. Not because he took a reckless risk. Because he breathed dust. That's what makes hantavirus so unsettling. The exposure feels ordinary. The outcome does not. Years later, the house still stands. The attic is clean now, professionally remediated, safe, at least as safe as anyone can make it. But there are rooms inside that house where Williams's absence still feels loud. His daughter grew up. Birthdays came and went. Graduations happened. Family photographs accumulated. And in every milestone, there was someone missing. Sarah eventually learned something grief counselors tell families all the time. Life moves forward, but grief doesn't move out. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, less visible. But it remains. Sometimes it appears unexpectedly. A song on the radio, a photograph in a drawer, a forgotten voicemail, an empty chair during a holiday dinner. For years, she replayed the same questions. What if he had worn a mask? What if they had hired professionals? What if they had recognized the symptoms sooner? What if they had gone back to the hospital a day earlier? The problem with those questions is that they never end. There is always another version of events, another decision, another possibility, another path that might have changed everything. But reality only gives you one. And Williams's path ended in an ICU room. His family eventually stopped asking whether the outcome could have been different. Not because they found answers, because there weren't any left to find. Instead, they focused on remembering the man who existed before the disease, the husband, the father, the friend, the guy who loved old houses, the guy who thought he could handle one dirty attic by himself, the guy who never imagined it would be the last major project of his life. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of stories like this. The final decision never feels important when you're making it. It only becomes important afterward. He cleaned an abandoned attic. The job took 3 hours. 3 hours of sweeping, 3 hours of dust, 3 hours of disturbing years of rodent nests and droppings. When he climbed back down the ladder, he thought the hard part was over. In reality, it had just begun. 14 days later, he was lying in an ICU bed fighting for every breath. Doctors surrounded him. Machines surrounded him. His family surrounded him. And none of them could stop what had already started. 21 days after that, he was gone. Not because of a dramatic accident. Not because of a violent injury. Not because of a disease most people have heard of. Because of something invisible. Something he inhaled without noticing. Something hidden inside ordinary dust. This story is not about fear. Millions of people clean attics, garages, sheds, barns, and crawl spaces every year without becoming sick. Most never experience any problems at all. But stories like Williams's are reminders that some risks don't look dangerous. The things that hurt us most are not always the things we can see. A ladder looks dangerous. A chainsaw looks dangerous. A collapsing roof looks dangerous. Dust does not. And that's exactly why people underestimate it. The dust had settled. The virus had not. William Smith cleaned an attic on a Saturday morning. By the end of the month, his family was planning a funeral. The distance between those two moments was only a few weeks. The distance between them was also a single decision. One attic, one exposure, one virus, one life. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free, and if you learned something from this case, like, share and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens?